This video goes with Chapter 13, and it talks about non-finite clauses, and it should especially help you with exercises 1 and 2 of Chapter 13. So let's see some of the characteristics of non-finite clauses. There are 4 characteristics about them that are more obvious than the others. One is that a non-finite clause can never be a main clause. A finite clause can be a main clause or subordinate, but a non-finite clause can never be a main clause. So, for example, an imperative clause is a main clause. That's never going to be a non-finite clause. The second thing, and this is the first thing actually to look for, is what kind of verb is the head of the clause. The head of a non-finite clause will be either a participle form, and remember there are 2 of those. There's gerund participles and past participles, so it'll be one of those, or else it'll be a plain form. Now, if the head verb of the clause is a participle form, it has to be non-finite. If the head verb of the clause is a plain form, it can be finite or non-finite. The finite ones are subjunctives and imperatives, and all the other ones are non-finite. You're going to see some examples of those later on. 2 other remarkable things about non-finite clauses is that a lot of times they don't have a subject. And as far as main clauses go, that's really only possible in English for imperatives, right? Except for a few weird cases, but normally it's only possible for imperatives not to have a subject if we're talking about finite clauses. But the non-finite ones, you'll see lots of examples where they don't have subjects, and also plenty where they do. And then also it's possible for them not to have an object in a place where a main clause would have to have one, where the verb usually does require one. Here are some examples of non-finite clauses for you. And the first couple examples we're going to look at have as their head verb a past participle. So look at the first sentence and you will see a main clause where the head verb of the main clause, right, is are. And the subject of are is, can you see it? And don't just say students. The subject of the main clause is students enrolled in high-poverty schools. That whole phrase is the subject. Now inside the phrase there, inside that noun phrase, there is a non-finite clause. It's modifying the head noun of the phrase, which is students. The non-finite clause is enrolled in high-poverty schools. And that's one of the ones that doesn't have a subject, right? It starts right off with the verb. And we don't see any other verbs there. The head of it has to be enrolled because it's a past participle. We know this has to be a non-finite clause. And you can see a very similar one in the second sentence. In the second sentence, the main clause is headed by the verb touches. And the subject of that is this moral tale. But before that main clause, there's another clause hanging out, written and directed. It's a coordinate clause, so there are 2 verbs connected by the coordinator. Written and directed by Amy Lagos. So the head verbs there are written and directed. Those are past participles. This has to be a non-finite clause. And again, it's an example of one that doesn't have a subject. Now, here is a comparison of non-finite clauses headed by a past participle and main clauses headed by a verb with tense. This is giving you guys a lot of trouble. This gave you guys a lot of trouble in early exercises. So pay attention to this part. It's tricky. Enrolled in high-poverty schools, as we just saw, is a non-finite clause because the head of it is a past participle. It just has to be non-finite. Now, what if we came upon this clause? Students are enrolled in high-poverty schools. Is this a finite clause or is it non-finite? Pause the tape if you want and ponder this for a second. It's important. Look for the verb that's the head of the clause. Now the head of this clause is the verb are. Now here's the thing. In high school, they probably told you that if you have a clause like this, the main verb The traditional grammars tend to use the phrase the main verb, and they would say that the main verb is enrolled. It is very unfortunate that they say that. That is true from a semantic point of view. It's true that the meaning of enrolled there is more central to the meaning of the sentence than the meaning of are, which is basically just modifying the base meaning of enrolled. But semantic analysis isn't what we're doing primarily here. Focus on syntax. If you ask yourselves what's the question, which verb, comparing are and enrolled, which verb is more important grammatically, you get the other answer. The important verb here is are. That's the one carrying the tense. So if we look at this whole clause, students are enrolled in high poverty schools, what we say is that are is the head verb and enrolled is the lexical verb. We very carefully avoid saying main verb because it's not main in a grammatical sense. Actually, if we break down the sentence, the detailed analysis is this. Enrolled in high poverty schools is a non-finite clause, and that non-finite clause is the complement of the verb are. So you have a verb phrase, are enrolled in high poverty schools, and the head of that phrase is are, and then enrolled in high poverty schools is inside it, is embedded inside it. It's the complement of the head verb. So therefore, when you have this clause, students enrolled in high poverty schools are more likely to encounter blah, blah, blah. If you're looking at the phrase enrolled in high poverty schools, you're calling it a non-finite clause because the head is enrolled. But if you're looking at the bigger clause, students enrolled in high poverty schools are more likely to encounter, the head is are and the clause is finite. Similarly, if you have a clause like students are enrolled in high poverty schools, that clause is finite. It has a non-finite clause inside it, but that's not the question. If the question is what kind of clause is the whole thing, it's finite. The main verb is are. Are is not a participle form and it's not a bare form, right? It's a present tense form. So the other one is just like that, right? Written and directed by Amy Lagos is non-finite because the head is written and directed. It's coordinated, right? Both of those are past participles. If we stumbled on the clause, this moral tale was written by Amy Lagos, then we would say that clause is finite. It has a verb with tense in it, was. It has a preterite form. The head of the clause is a preterite form. And a preterite form heads a finite clause. It doesn't head a non-finite clause. So that's a little bit sticky. So then we can see exactly the same deal with gerund participles. If we have the people passing by were just as interesting to Lacey. And if we look at just the clause passing by, then what we have there is a clause headed by a gerund participle with no subject, right? And similarly, using all the profane German I had ever heard is headed by the verb using, a gerund participle. So both of those clauses are non-finite. We can compare them, just like we did with the past participle, we can compare them to clauses where the lexical verb is a gerund participle, but the main verb has tense. Here, the people are passing by. This clause is finite. The head verb is are. Passing is the lexical verb. Passing by, again, is a complement to head. And similarly, if we stumbled on the clause, I was using all the profane German I had ever heard, that's obviously finite because the head of it is a preterite form, was. But just using all the profane German I had ever heard is headed by using. That's a gerund participle. It's non-finite. So now you've seen examples of non-finite clauses that are headed by past participles and headed by gerund participles. And now we're going to look at non-finite clauses that are headed by plain forms. But first, let me show you some clauses headed by plain forms that are not non-finite clauses. And do you remember what kinds those are that we mentioned at the beginning? Imperative clauses are headed by plain forms, but they're finite, and subjunctive clauses are headed by plain forms, but they're finite. So here, in the first sentence, you have two imperative clauses. The characteristics of imperative clauses, you remember, there's no subject, and there's a verb, the head verb is in the bare form. And, it's a main clause. That will distinguish it from non-finite clauses. Imperative clauses are main clauses. So you could say, try one or all of them today, and you could be done there. You could say, start living well, looking good, and feeling great, and you would be done. You can coordinate those two with a coordinator, and you know that we can do that with independent clauses, with main clauses. So those are imperatives. Don't call those non-finite, and that's going to be important in exercise 2. And then the second sentence here shows you a subjunctive. The subjunctive is, she stopped her sweeping. Right? The main clause verb is considered. So the subject of considered is she, and my insistence that she stop her sweeping is actually an object. It's just not in the canonical object place. But she stop her sweeping is a finite clause, and the head of the clause is stop, and it's not the present tense, right? If it were, it would have to be she stops. And why is it okay for it to be she stop? Because it's a subjunctive. If you remember, we talked about those. That's when you can use the bare form of the verb, no matter what the subject is. Subjunctive clauses do have subjects, but the verb doesn't usually agree. If it does, we call it a different kind of subjunctive. In the traditional subjunctive, the verb doesn't agree. It's just the plain form. And subjunctive clauses can only occur in they're always dependent clauses, they're always subordinate, and they can occur after certain nouns or verbs or adjectives, and it's generally the ones that have the idea of, see, we fade into semantics a little bit here. It's generally the class of verbs, nouns, and adjectives that have the idea of requiring something, making something necessary, making it mandatory. So it's like insist, essential, demand, that sort of thing. Requirement, that sort of thing. So imperative clauses and subjunctive clauses are not non-finite. However, other kinds of clauses that are headed by bare form verbs, plain form verbs, are non-finite. And those are mainly the ones headed by infinitives. And remember, there are two kinds of infinitives. There's the ones that have two and the ones that don't have two. So two infinitives and bare infinitives. So you have an example of each one here. Why does the study of Augustine, Dante, or Aquinas help us to be free? To be free is a non-finite clause headed by a to infinitive. And it doesn't have a subject. A lot of the to infinitives don't have a subject, right? Here in your fourth sentence is an example of a clause headed by a bare infinitive. Him make big plays. This one does have a subject, but a lot of times the subject in a non-finite clause isn't the nominative case. It can actually be the objective case. So it can be him or her instead of he or she, for example. They have tons of speed and talent around him that can help him make big plays. That whole non-finite clause there, headed by a plain form, headed by a bare infinitive, is the complement of help. So now you've seen non-finite clauses headed by both kinds of participle forms and by both kinds of infinitives. Now I'd like to show you a very common place for the non-finite clauses headed by bare infinitives. They very often occur after modals. In fact, modals require that kind of a complement in English. The modal verbs require a complement clause that's headed by a plain form verb and doesn't have a subject. So look at the first sentence and look for a modal verb. Do you see it? And then once you found it, put in brackets, mentally put in brackets, the clause that is the complement of the modal verb. And do the same thing with the second sentence. And if you're stuck on finding the modal verbs, I'll give them to you. The modal verb in the first one is might, and the modal verb in the second one is will. Now, can you bracket the clauses? When you've bracketed the clauses, identified the clauses that are the complements of those modals, go to the next slide, and that's where I have them bracketed. Be at risk for hearing loss and iPod oblivion injuries. And if you think due to PLD use is modifying injuries, then you would include that. I couldn't quite figure out if it was modifying that or modifying the whole clause. But the point is that no matter what, the complement clause there will be headed by a plain form B. B is a really obvious one, right? That can only be a plain form. In the second sentence, do what is feasible is headed by do, again a plain form, and that is the complement of will. So we referred to this real early in the semester, and we said that we wouldn't deal with it at that point because it's kind of a finer point. But in I will do what is feasible, you do technically have two clauses. You do technically have an embedded clause, do what is feasible. Anytime you have a modal verb, there's technically an embedded clause that is its complement. And they're headed by bare infinitives. Okay, that brings us to syntactic determination. We've said that in a lot of cases, and we've seen a lot of examples where the non-finite clauses don't have a subject. So how, in fact, do the hearers know what the subject of that verb is? Do they, in fact, know? And the answer is a little bit complicated. Part of the answer is syntactic determination, which is to say, sometimes we absolutely do know because the structure of the main clause doesn't leave any choice. It tells exactly what the subject has to be. Now, I'm going to show you first an example where that doesn't happen. Look, I'm just demonstrating to you here that verbs can do this sort of thing. Verbs have specific properties in English going outside of themselves and influencing the interpretation of things like their complements. So look at the first sentence. Arthur says to let him know when I hear anything new about Sarah. Now the clause there, thus non-finite clause that I have bracketed, has no subject, right? But there, semantically, there should be somebody who lets him know when I hear anything new about Sarah, right? You will interpret that as having a, not grammatical subject, but let's say a logical subject, subject as far as meaning goes. Now, is it possible for the subject of let him know to be Arthur? Arthur says for Arthur to let him know. It isn't, right? No. The verb say works like this, such that if it has a subject, if it's a main clause verb and it has a subject, so somebody says, and then the complement is a to infinitive clause, the logical subject of that to infinitive clause cannot be the same person who said. And it doesn't matter if that him is there or not, right? Arthur says to go to the store. That can be a lot of different people going to the store, but it absolutely cannot be Arthur. So that's not syntactic determination, but that is to show you that verbs can do things like make predictions about, not make predictions, can require certain interpretations about the logical subject of another verb, and they can rule out certain interpretations about the logical subject of another verb. Syntactic determination is the first case. Syntactic determination is when the main clause verb actually tells you for sure who the logical subject of the non-finite clause verb is, of the complement clause verb is. So let's see an example where that happens. 93% of Americans plan to spend less or the same amount as last year. Now, do we know the logical subject of spending less? Do we know who's going to spend less? Yes, it's Americans, right? There's absolutely no question. It's part of what we know about the verb plan. When you learn the verb plan, one thing you learned about that verb at some point was that if it's used in this kind of construction where it has a to infinitive as a complement, then the subject, the logical subject of that to infinitive, is the same person who plans. That's syntactic determination. When you get the subject of the non-finite clause from the main clause. And here are some more examples. The first one I'm just demonstrating to you, we don't even have to know who plans. If I just say to you, so-and-so plans, or X, some abstract entity plans to spend less or the same amount as last year, you know that the person spending less is the same X, right? Plans has that characteristic. Want can also do that. Also does that, not can, always does do that. Planetary scientists want to know what comets are made of. It can only be the planetary scientists who are the subject of to know, right? You can, of course, put in another subject here. Planetary scientists want you to know. Yeah, you can do that. But if there's no subject there, it's syntactically determined if the matrix clause verb is want, and if the matrix clause verb is try. And the non-finite clause is headed by a gerund participle. Works the same way. This is also syntactic determination. He tried pushing the penguins into the water. Who pushed the penguins into the water? The same person who tried. Try is like that. It just assigns the same subject that it has to the non-finite clause. So those are the cases where the subject is syntactically determined, and we do in fact know for sure who it is. And here are some cases where it's not, because that doesn't always happen. Using two turbines with two computerized controllers is cumbersome. Now, who is using two turbines? We have no idea. And in fact, we do not care, right? The persons chose this, and this came out of the corpus. Somebody really said this or wrote it, I don't know which. But the producer of this sentence is not at all concerned with who is using two turbines. They're concerned with the process. And so the lack of syntactic determination is perfectly appropriate. We don't have to say it's a bad sentence. It's a good sentence. All we have to say when we analyze it is that the subject of the verb of the non-finite clause is not syntactically determined. And the second one is similar. It's important to note that all of the children in the study attend Virginia public schools. It's important for whom to note. Yeah, we don't really care. And you can probably get it by the context. You can probably say, this sounds like it comes from an article, right? So you can probably say it's important for the reader of the article to note. But really the subject there is not very important, and it's not syntactically determined. Now, in the third one, I bet you think it's silly to wear all this makeup. We can, in fact, figure out pretty definitely that the subject of wear is the speaker. It would be kind of a ridiculous sentence if it were anybody else, right? If she were talking about her sister, she wouldn't say, I bet you think it's silly to wear all this makeup, to the mom or whoever is listening, right? It pretty much has to be the speaker. But is that determined from the matrix clause? No. The speaker doesn't even appear in the matrix clause. The subject of the matrix clause is you, referring to, of course, the interlocutor. So is this syntactic determination? No. We can figure out who the subject is, but we're not figuring it out from the syntax. We're figuring it out from the context or from discourse principles. Discourse principle, despite what syntacticians will try to tell you, syntax can't do everything, can't explain everything about a language. And one of the things that probably discourse principles can explain is this, how we know who the subject of to where is. It's not syntactic determination. So these are cases where there is no determination, which is not to say they're bad sentences. They're different. And then the really, really fun ones. The ones that are sit on the border between syntactic determination and no syntactic determination. And these are the adjunct clauses. And this is where the famous dangling modifier problem comes up, or dangling participial, if you like those big words. Let's see, this is a sentence that you've already seen. Using all the profane German I had ever heard, I ordered him to come out. Now look in the matrix clause. There are two noun phrases, right? I and him. And the I is somewhat more prominent syntactically because it's a subject. And what you ideally want is for the subject of the matrix clause to also be the logical subject of the adjunct clause. If that works, then you don't have a dangling modifier. You have a good sentence. So the subject of the matrix clause is I, and the verb in the non-finite clause is using. So is the I the same person who is using all the profane German that person has ever heard? Yes, you bet. And so this is a good sentence. Let's do the second one. The subject of the matrix clause, you find it. Ignore the adjunct for a minute. It's the musical, right? The main verb is realize. Its subject is the musical. Now the adjunct clause is directed by Matthew Warchus. Can the subject of the matrix clause be the logical subject of directed by? In other words, is the musical directed by Matthew Warchus? Yeah. So it's a good sentence. This is not a dangling modifier either. This is a good modifier. So these were both really good sentences. The third one is also good. Find the matrix clause subject. The verb is. The subject is this antic multi-generational conversation. Can we say this antic multi-generational conversation is written, directed, and performed by the video artist Caleb Lindsay? Yep. These are good adjunct clauses. The subject of the matrix clause is also the logical subject of the verb in the non-finite clause. Now in the exercise, it's not going to ask you exactly if the subject of the matrix clause is a good logical subject for the non-finite clause. It's going to ask you if there's a noun phrase anywhere in the matrix clause that can be a good subject. But I do not think that's going to cause you any confusion. And what you really want is for it to be the subject. So imagine the clauses had been written like this. These are dangling modifiers. Using all the profane German we had ever heard, he was ordered to come out. Subject of the matrix clause has changed now, right? It's he. Is he using all the profane German we had ever heard? That's a dangling modifier. Second one, suppose we change this clause so the subject is the slick digital scenery and modestly ingenious special effects. Are those things directed by Matthew Warchus? No, we don't usually say scenery is directed by somebody and special effects are directed by somebody. Movies are directed by somebody. So if the subject of that matrix clause is not the movie, it's a dangling modifier. Can you figure out what it means? Yeah. But it's not optimal, but the style's not optimal. These are among the, when the meaning is really clear, these are not among the terribly serious errors you can make, but they do give, somebody who's used to good prescriptive grammar, they do give them pause. It's like if your professors are used to reading papers well written from a prescriptive point of view, this is going to kind of, distract them for a moment from the meaning of what you're saying. So don't focus on these to the exclusion of more serious problems with your writing. But if you're at the level where you can solve these smaller problems, then it's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to not use dangling modifiers. But there is one more wrinkle to the dangling modifier problem. Look at the last sentence. Having seen that, how much is different now? Analyze it technically first. What is the subject of that interrogative clause? How much is different now? It's how much, right? It can only be that. That's the only noun phrase there. Can how much be the logical subject of having seen that? No. How much can't have seen anything. So is it a dangling modifier? Technically, yes. From the strictly grammatical point of view, this is a dangling modifier. Does this sentence sound bad to you? And now I'm asking you a referential question. I do not know the answer. You decide how bad that sentence sounds to you. I am not sure I would use that sentence, but it definitely sounds not nearly as bad to me as the first two. Because here's the trick. There are certain phrases that are technically dangling modifiers the way that we normally use them. However, they've gotten to be so conventionalized that they sound okay. And it's not a case of just, I know what you guys want to say, that, you know, people's grammar is getting sloppier and sloppier. And by the way, you absolutely can't document that. But even if it were true, this is not a case of us just getting used to a bad usage and deciding it's okay. It's a case of we've sort of adopted a particular phrase so that it's more or less an idiom, and we're not really breaking down the structure of it. So if we read it, no matter how prescriptively careful we are or fussy we are, if we read that kind of phrase, it really doesn't give us pause because it's just become conventional to use that. Here, the examples are more clear than the explanation. Look at this. Given Joan's age, this will also be free of charge to her as an individual. All these are examples from the corpus. I didn't make up any. Doesn't that first one sound all right to you? It's technically a dangling modifier. Look, the subject of the matrix clause is this. And this is presumably a medical treatment or something, right? This is definitely not given Joan's age. Nobody gives Joan's age to this. But we use given all the time like that, right? So it's sort of become a preposition more than a past participle, and we're not looking for a subject. So don't call this wrong. Yes, technically it's a dangling modifier. In the exercise, if they gave you this, and they said, is there a noun phrase in the matrix clause that could be the logical subject of given? Your answer would be no. But then if they asked you, would this be considered a dangling modifier, your answer should be probably not, because we use phrases starting with given at the beginning like this all the time. And they've gotten to be treated more as just a prepositional phrase or some kind of idiom than actually a participial clause, a clause headed by a participle. We do the same thing with considering. Considering that she grew up in a tree with little elves that bake cookies, she's done very well. The subject of the matrix clause is she. Is she the one considering that she grew up in a tree? No, the speaker is considering that. And when you say considering that, you're actually asking the audience to consider that fact. That's the discourse principle of it. So the discourse kind of overrides the syntax here, and it makes it okay. Is it a dangling modifier? Technically, yes. Is it one that you would mark wrong on a paper? No, don't do that. Same with this one. Based on a tip, detectives from New York City drove blah, blah, blah. Are the detectives based on a tip? No, of course not. Is it a dangling modifier? Yes, technically. Would we mark this wrong in a paper? No, we wouldn't be jerks like that. This is a perfectly good usage. So now you've also seen how non-finite clauses can have their subject syntactically determined, or they don't have to have their subject syntactically determined. And you've seen how they work as adjuncts when they kind of get their subject from the main clause. And then if we remember the last characteristic that we mentioned of non-finite clauses, it's that they don't always have an object, where a main clause would be required to. A non-finite clause can sometimes leave it out. So there are some verbs in English that you don't use without an object, right? Like do. You don't usually say I do unless you're getting married, or he does, unless the context makes clear that you're leaving out a clause, right? Like, does he do that? Yeah, he does. But we can use the verb do without an object in a clause like this. It's just a really difficult thing for us to do. Do should have an object there, right? If it was a main clause, it wouldn't be we do. It would be we do this difficult thing. But to do, you can leave it out, and it's good. The hearer is gonna retrieve the object from the main clause. They're gonna go get the thing from the matrix clause. Here's another example. That is a hard thing for us to bear. We can't really say I bear or I can't bear. We say I can't bear it, even when the it doesn't have a specific referent, right? That verb wants to have an object, but if it's to bear, then it's okay. These are called the hollow non-finites, where it's a to infinitive, and you leave off the object. And one more example. That's easy for them to say. Usually we can't say I say, unless you're foghorn, leghorn, I say. But normally we don't go around saying I say, we say something. I say so, even if you have to just say so. You say something, right? But you can have, that's easy for them to say. Those are the things that identify the non-finite clauses, but do remember to look first for the verb that heads the clause. That's your first step in identifying a clause that's non-finite. If the head verb is a participle, the clause has to be non-finite. If the head verb is a plain form, its clause is non-finite unless it's subjunctive or imperative. And if the head verb is something else, it's not a non-finite clause, it's finite.